jump in, Joe.
All right. Let me just start off by saying, thanks everybody for coming, in particular the Fairform strikers for coming down here tonight to participate in this discussion, and really for all that you're doing to fight not only for yourselves but for everybody. It's just inspiration when people are willing to take a stand like you all are doing against corporate greed. Let me just start by talking a little bit about, let me give you a little bit of my background. So I grew up in a working class neighborhood in North Minneapolis, and I didn't really realize it at the time, but really the unions and the strike made possible an entire way of life for a kid growing up in the 1960s and 70s. My dad was a member of the cops union, and all my neighbors were in unions, and they could afford a cabin up north in, as we call it, Minnesota. That's how we won our pensions and our health care and so forth. And it really contributed to having a society where income distribution was a lot more equal and very different from what we're seeing today. I went to the University of Minnesota, and then following that I became a healthcare worker, got involved in my union, and became a local union president with AFSCME, and did a lot of strike support work throughout the 1990s, through the late 1980s and 1990s. When I went to law school, though, I went to New York University, and in law school I really first started thinking about writing a book about labor. Because when I went to law school, what I started to realize and look at was that labor law had been transformed from something that used to be to protect workers and provide for rights for workers into what I call a system of labor control, where labor law had really been turned on its head and was being used to prevent effective trade unionism and effective strike activity in particular. Following that, I kind of set the idea aside. I was doing bargaining in healthcare and then most recently in the airline industry. Finally, I got back to writing a book, and I wrote my first book, which is called Reviving the Strike. And when I started out, it really wasn't necessarily about the strike. It was about labor law and so forth. But as I started writing, I came to realize that the labor movement had really abandoned what was, for 150 years, considered our most essential tactic, the strike. And it would have been inconceivable for generations of trade unionists to think that we could have a labor movement without having a strike. So beginning in the early beginnings of trade unions in the 1800s in the United States, the strike and strike activity was really how people got employers to recognize them. It's how we won our contracts, because obviously, as anyone who spent time at a bargaining table knows, you can make the most fancy arguments to the employer, or argue reasons why they should agree to something, but at the end of the day, all too often they just don't care. And traditionally, unions have needed a source of power to be able to win the sort of things that we need to win as working people in this country. So in particular, when I researched it, I came to discover that really the strike is how we created the modern labor movement. If you look at the 1930s, we had union levels, union density levels very low entering the 1930s, and even though we were in a depression and unemployment was high, we had this incredible strike wave that happened. In 1934, this is before the National Labor Relations Act is even passed, you have a series of major confrontations in U.S. cities. So Minneapolis, which is my hometown, we had the Minneapolis Teamster strike, where the Teamster truck drivers basically shut the city down. They didn't strike like they strike today with one little company. They struck all of the Teamster truck drivers struck at once, and created a really what became a national issue, and forced the White House to get involved and reached a settlement there. On the West Coast ports, it's the same story. There was a general strike where all the workers went out. So basically you have this high level of strike activity, and in response the government says, hey, we need to do something about this. So they passed the National Labor Relations Act. And even then, employers refused to follow the law, just like they do today. You know, we're supposed to have labor law to protect workers, but employers routinely violate them. It's no different back in the 1930s. What's different in the 1930s is that workers took matters into their own hands. We had 500,000, or 400,000, excuse me, workers engaged in sit-down strikes in 1937 alone. Not just in the great auto plants, we hear about the Flint sit-down strike, but Woolworth counters, you know, the Woolworth lunch counters that they used to have. You know, those workers went on strike. All over the country, workers went on strike. And what they were saying is they were striking to force the employers to follow the law and to force the employers to recognize their unions. And they did. And unionization grew fourfold. So it was very, unionization didn't look, our future didn't look very good in the early 1930s. Yet coming out of the 1930s and leading on into the 1940s, we ended up with a very strong and powerful labor movement. And throughout the 1950s, trade unions struck. So when we think of all the contracts and the things you're trying to defend today, those were won through repeated strike activity through the 1950s. Take the steelworkers, for example. They struck 10 times between 1946 and 1959, but in the process won a 110% increase in real wages, won the health and safety language, won their pensions, won the employer-paid health care. And it was you could pick an industry and you could really see how trade unionism was really able to transform entire industries and create a better way of life for working people. So you basically, you know, so you have this powerful strike and high levels of strike activity. So if you compare the levels of strike activity, what you find in the 1950s is that there were an average of over 350 major strikes per year, and that's over major strikes over 1,000 workers. So you have over 350 throughout the 1950s, and then you get to the last decade, and that 350 plummets to a handful. So you have an average of 10. I think in 2014 was the second worst year. There was a year back like 2006 or 7 where it was a little bit lower. But you had 9 major work stoppages in 2014. And you all at Fairpoint are one of them, and by far the longest and the most lost work days of all of those confrontations. So you can see that we have a drastic drop in strike activity, and that's really related to, in my opinion, to the weakness of the modern labor movement, because it's very difficult to have a labor movement and collective bargaining if we don't have the strike to back us up. And it's also related to the gross inequality we're seeing in society, because there's no counterbalance to corporate power. So let me just talk a couple minutes about you know, why did strike activity drop off so much? So some people used to say, well, it's because we exist in a global economy, and those are the reasons that, you know, striking doesn't work anymore, or there's been changes in how work is structured, and they have all of these different reasons. And some of them have some validity, but if you really analyze it, they don't really answer the question. Because how do we explain like meat packing or truck driving, which are industries that aren't really in global competition directly, but nonetheless have seen drastic drops in both strike activity and levels of unionization. So you really have to look elsewhere, and what I do in the book is I look at the changes in labor law that have occurred over the years to really make it so that the rules of the game have changed. And that a strike today looks very different than the strikes that really were utilized in the 1930s and beyond, even up through the 1970s. And they're different in a number of ways. One of the ways that they're different is that it's the whole issue of solidarity. Today, employers want you to go out well, they don't want you to have a union at all, but if you have to have a union and you do go out on strike, they try and make it so it's a real narrow dispute between just the employees of the company and the company. And often it can be a small work site, or it can even be part of a company. So you take the J Main strike, you know, that's an example where the paper workers go up against this giant corporation, and rather than everybody striking the entire corporation at once, which is how it used to be done, or the entire industry, they would only strike, you know, one plant of one employee. That happened, you know, recently Caterpillar, if you think of their strike last year over in Illinois, where they went out in one plant. And those types of strikes are very difficult because you're taking on a giant corporation that has deep pockets, but you're only striking them at one location. But if you look in contrast about what did strikes look like back in the day, and they were very different. Level of strike activity where workers are trying to fight back in every industry, meat packing, you know, Phelps Dodge and mining and so forth. And workers are trying to take a stand, paper workers, it doesn't matter which industry, you can pick it. But they're doing it with this set of rules that allows employers to it basically takes away the right to a real strike or an effective strike. So workers can be permanently replaced. You see that even though the Supreme Court decided that back in 1939 that employers could do that, which makes no sense. I mean, that's not what the law is supposed to say. You're supposed to have the right to strike. How can you have the right to strike if you could be permanently replaced? That's not really the right to strike. But nonetheless, that becomes the tactics used by employers in the 1980s and beyond to you know, help employers you know, kind of bust the unions. So let's switch over. I'm going to say a few more words and you know, kind of about the future and where we go from there. So really, what the labor movement did is a lot of people said, look, striking isn't working, so let's just look for other ways to revive the labor movement. And that was really by the mid-1990s. There became a sense of, you know, the labor movement tried to reform labor law, tried to get permanent replacements passed twice in the early 90s. That failed. And then switched the attention to organizing the unorganized, to social unionism, to all these other ideas about how we can revive the labor movement. And you know, all of them are good ideas, and they all make sense, and they're all absolutely necessary of what we have to do. We only represent 6 out of 100 workers in the private sector, so obviously we need to organize more workers. We need to reach out to the community. But I think what was lost in the process is if we don't have a way of forcing employers to improve workers' lives, then how can we really have and build a labor movement? And to me, that really became the key question. Not that it's an easy question. There is no easy answer to the revival of the labor movement at this point in time. But I strongly believe that, you know, we need to start going back to the fundamentals of trade unionism and try and figure out how we can do that. And to do that, I'm going to keep this short, but you know, so that's really what brought me to my second book, which is called Strike Back, which is, on the face of it, really is about public employee strikes, but I think it's something that really speaks to all workers in our strategy. And what I did is I looked at the great public employee strike wave of the 1960s. And you don't really hear about that. I was a public employee in the 1990s and a union president, but I didn't really know this history that we had. And we think about the 60s and the protest movements, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and all of these great social movements. And we don't really think about as being part of that, the public employees. But public employees engaged in one of the great campaigns of civil disobedience in U.S. history. Striking was illegal in every state in the United States and the federal government where it was a felony, all throughout the 1960s. Yet hundreds of thousands of public workers went out on strike. And what they said is they were willing to violate the law because They understood that their right to strike was a fundamental human right. And it wasn't something that a legislature or a judge or a court or a politician could take away. And they really, what they were able to do is, starting with the New York teachers in 1960, where a small group of New York teachers, 5,000 out of 35,000, went out on strike. But they timed it the day before election, and they were able to win that strike, and they won their union, and then 2 years later they went out, and more teachers joined them, and they were able to establish collective bargaining for teachers in New York City, and really started this strike wave that swept the country. So teachers all over the country were striking, whereas in 1958 there were 0 teacher strikes in the entire country. Throughout the 1950s there were only 3 teacher strikes in the entire country out of thousands of school districts. Yet in the 1960s though, you have this strike wave where teachers start going out on strike. Hundreds of thousands are going out on strike. And they're followed by occupational waves, so sanitation workers start going out on strike. A lot of them tied in with the civil rights movement. Then you see even police and firefighters, which it was always considered that they could never strike after the Boston police strike over in Boston. Got crushed back in 1919. And for a generation, it was used to say that public employees couldn't strike. Yet we even see teachers and firefighters and police striking. And through that process, it really backs up kind of what was said in Reviving the Strike, that the strike really created this whole public employee labor movement in the 1960s and 70s. And by striking, they not only won their contracts, but interestingly, they won changes in labor law. And in study after study that I've read, it shows that labor law had really little impact. Whether striking was legal or illegal in a given state had very little to do with the level of strike activity. In fact, some of the most strike-prone states were states where striking was illegal throughout the entire period. What we found is what was far more important was the level of community support, the level of unionization that existed in the private sector, the sort of strength and ties that they were able to build had a lot more to do with whether or not they were successful in their strike activity. So I think, for me, looking at that history, there's a lot of things that we can learn. And I'm just going to do them in bullet points so we can get to the discussion. But I think for public workers who are under attack, public employee unionism came out of the 1980s and 1990s in far better shape than the private sector. 40% of public employees are still in unions, and that compares to 6% in the private sector. They escaped, with their contracts better and so forth, but now they're under attack. In state after state, they're trying to take away public employee bargaining rights, and politicians are taking a hard line with them. So for public employees, I think we can look back at the period and we can learn about public employee social unionism, how were public employees able to forge these deep ties with the community and able to win their strikes. So I think there's a lot of lessons there. There's a lot of lessons about how can we confront repressive labor law? How do we break ourselves out of this box? How did they do it? How were they able to, get workers to defy injunctions and do what was needed to win their strikes? And I think there's a lot of inspirational stories that we can find from the period. So anyway, those are some of the ideas that I like to talk about. And I think the final thing just to mention is, it's a very difficult time for the labor movement now. We've got a lot of attacks going on for us. But one of the good things about studying these other periods in labor history is we see how quickly things can change, and it really gives you a sense of hope. I don't think anyone would have predicted in the early 1960s that we would have this massive upsurge of public workers nor did they predict in the early 1930s that what would happen. What we do find in labor history is that unions grow in these great upsurges, where working people just get fed up with it.